Have you felt like you have a tendency to procrastinate more than usual lately? Have you felt a general drop in libido or attraction to your partner? Or perhaps you have noticed that you're having a harder time with concentration and focus? Well, believe it or not, but these are just a few examples of what can happen if you consume a lot of online porn. Scandinavian Bob here, hi. Yeah, a real voice and person behind this video, who has been involved in the porn addiction community for 13 years now and helped hundreds of guys quit for good. So if you don't like all these fake AI videos out there, consider subscribing. I'm just a guy who was severely affected by porn and who, after I found out what it was doing to me, tried to give it up for more than 7 years before I finally managed to do so. In other words, I was addicted to porn. And in this video series, I'm going to share with you how porn can change the brain, and more importantly, how you can change it back. And this is something I believe everyone should know about, because although these brain changes are most common in people with a real porn addiction, you should know that, first of all, addiction is not an on-off thing. You can be more or less addicted. So you can have mild addiction-related brain changes going on without even knowing it. And some of the things you are about to discover can even affect people who are not addicted. So please stay with me here, because I promise you this is something you really have to know. Alright, so if this is the first time you're hearing about this, you might be surprised to know that watching too much online porn actually can cause things like I mentioned in the start. But it is absolutely true, and before we move on, I also need to make it clear that I am specifically talking about online porn here, because it is actually not so much the porn in and of itself that's the problem. It is when we combine it with today's delivery system that it can become problematic. In other words, the internet. So for example, back in the day, those old porn magazines were not potent enough to cause any problems, or the old VHS tapes. But today, everyone obviously consumes porn on the internet, and therein lies the problem. Because with online porn, there is endless novelty, which means you can keep your dopamine levels elevated with the click of a mouse, basically as long as you want. And by doing so, you can override your natural satiation mechanism. You see, your ancient reward system did not come equipped with being able to handle all that stimuli. Think about it. It is now possible for a porn user to see more hot babes in one single porn session than his ancestors were able to see in several lifetimes. You can see more naked babes than they could see in several hundreds of lifetimes even. All with a click of a mouse. Searching, clicking, getting dragged along to the next clip and the next clip and the next, fast forwarding with multiple tabs open, all while keeping the dopamine levels sky high for sometimes hours on end. We are going to talk more about exactly why that's a problem a bit further on, but with this I think most of you already can start to see how that could perhaps not be such a healthy thing to do. So let's now take a look at some of the most common negative effects that online porn can cause, so that you know why I feel so strongly about the importance of learning this. Watching a lot of porn can cause people to experience increased fear and anxiety, lack of motivation and drive, delayed ejaculation. In other words, they have trouble climaxing when with a real partner. A sensation of having dulled senses, porn-induced erectile dysfunction. Yes, you may have heard that porn can cause erection problems. And perhaps you've been wondering, is that really true? And I'm here to tell you that yes, it is really true. And by the way, the delayed ejaculation thing here is just one step ahead in the process before developing PIED. So if you're noticing having problems with that, be happy that you found out about it now, so that you can stop the porn before porn-induced ED develops. It is like Dr. Carlo Foresta, the head of the Italian Society of Andrology and Sexual Medicine said, quote, It starts with lower reactions to porn sites. Then there is a general drop in libido, and in the end it becomes impossible to get an erection. Unquote. Yeah, and he was one of the first experts to notice this phenomenon just a few years after high-speed internet with streaming tube sites had entered the market. Now, porn-induced ED happens because of two things. The first one is desensitization, and that's the one that Dr. Foresta talked about in the quote there. But then there is also sexual conditioning at play here, meaning you have conditioned your brain to respond more to pixels on a screen than to real-life people. You see, whenever your dopamine levels are high, your brain is a learning machine because it interprets elevated dopamine levels as the situation being vital for survival. And remember when I just said that with online porn, it is possible to keep your dopamine levels elevated for as long as you want with the click of a mouse. And since the brain is a super learner during times of elevated dopamine, if you then are sitting there clicking from video to video while you at the same time are also masturbating, well then your brain is going to start to pair your libido with pixels on a screen. This is sexual conditioning, and it's why we say that porn can hijack your real libido. It is like Gary Wilson used to say, you are training for the wrong sport. Yes, and so watching a lot of porn can also cause brain fog and concentration problems, social anxiety. It can also cause low energy and low mood. Yes, people who are very addicted to porn often feel like nothing in life can deliver any pleasure any longer, except for porn. And often even the porn stops working after the addiction progresses. In other words, depression and anhedonia can become a problem. By the way, anhedonia is simply a condition where you are incapable of feeling pleasure. It is like Anna Lemke, one of the world's leading addiction experts, says, quote, ironically, chasing pleasure for pleasure itself often leads to anhedonia, unquote. And porn can also cause low libido, especially for real-life people, like I already mentioned. It can cause morphing sexual taste. And this is often because by watching a lot of porn, people quickly escalate and start watching more and more extreme stuff in order to get the same kick. This is also due to desensitization, by the way. Another way to put desensitization is that you get a numb pleasure response. Now, there are more potential negative consequences than these, but these are the ones that are the absolute most common ones we see people who watch online porn can start developing. Alright, so now let's move on to the next section of this video, where we will take a look at the 4 fundamental brain changes that happen in any addiction and that are behind many of these negative symptoms that I just shared. Please pay attention now, because this is going to be so important for you to discover. The 4 brain changes are 1. Desensitization, 2. Sensitization, 3. Hypofrontality, 4. Malfunctioning stress system. Alright, so we already touched a bit on desensitization, but let's take a deeper dive into the mechanism of how that happens. And in order to do so, I'm going to share a short clip from another presentation I made for a course a while back. So here goes. This, ladies and gentlemen, is desensitization.
Alright, so we are back on the animation board, and now we are going to take a look at the desensitization process. In other words, what can happen if you keep overusing instant gratification, super stimulating things. So what you are looking at here is a part of the dopamine system in action. To the left we have the sending neuron, and to the right the receiving neuron. See those small dots there? Well, that is our friend dopamine right there. And dopamine does its magic by attaching to the small dopamine receptors here, the small slots that the dopamine molecules fit perfectly into. And when dopamine has sparked into those, it is then we feel the effects of dopamine. Now, what happens if we expose our brain to very stimulating things is that the brain starts going, oh no, now there's too much dopamine here. I need to protect myself from it. And it does so by reducing the number of dopamine receptors, as you can see on the animation eraser right now. And the thing is, with less dopamine receptors, those small dopamine molecules now have less slots to park into, which means we feel less effects of whatever dopamine a certain activity gives us. Just a short example here. Let's say that a certain activity gives you a certain amount of fun and pleasure. And let's just for the sake of this example come up with a unit for that fun and pleasure. Let's call the unit FN. As in, fun. Okay, so then let's say that every Wednesday night you have band practice where you play your musical instrument. And that activity is giving you, let's say, 56 FN. Well, if you desensitize your reward system by, for example, watching way too much porn, now when you go to your band practice, even though the sending neuron is sending you 56 FN, it will only feel like maybe 39 FN, because you now have less of those small dopamine receptors. And the scary part here is a receptor is a receptor, meaning this feeling less effects of dopamine is now gonna be true for every single activity you do. Every single activity, not just music or porn or whatever, but every single activity. This is the neurobiological process behind desensitization, also known as getting a numb pleasure response or a disrupted dopamine system.
Alright, so that is the mechanism behind desensitization. And now you also understand why I said that the fact that you can keep clicking from video to video, keeping your dopamine levels elevated for a very long time can become problematic, because it can reduce the number of your dopamine receptors. And you should know that those receptors do not instantly grow back. No. It can sometimes take weeks to months, depending on the situation and the addiction and the person. And this is only if the person quits or drastically reduces his use, of course, which is a must if he wants them to grow back at all. Now, in the midst of my own porn addiction, I was severely affected by desensitization myself. And believe me when I say, if you keep digging that hole deeper and deeper with more and more instant gratification, you can turn your situation into complete hell, because everything in life will start to feel gray and boring. Well, that's a good definition of hell right there. So yeah, I'm not exaggerating here. And the disrupted dopamine system you just saw is also the biggest reason behind why watching a lot of porn can give you things like low motivation and drive, social anxiety, lack of concentration, and many of the things we started off the video by looking at. Yes, it's true, because you see, dopamine is highly involved with, for example, motivation and drive. In fact, dopamine is the very go after it neurotransmitter. So if your dopamine system is not working properly, it will be super difficult to muster up any motivation and drive at all. And yes, dopamine is also involved with concentration and focus, and it can play a part in anxiety as well, and so on. So desensitization is the biggest problem that can be caused by online porn. We will take a look at the rest of the brain changes and how to deal with all of that in part 2 of this series. Welcome to part 2 of how porn affects the brain. Alright, so as you remember, these are the 4 addiction-related brain changes that we are dealing with here. And in part 1, we talked a lot about desensitization. But did you know that desensitization can actually take place to a certain extent even if you're not addicted? Now, desensitization often becomes much more severe if you are really addicted, obviously. But I repeat, you don't have to be an addict in order to knock out some of the dopamine receptors. receptors. And if you're not really addicted and you stop hammering them, they will also grow back sooner than if you have a full-blown addiction. Now, this is just one reason behind why guys who give up porn tend to see such a different timeline of when they start to feel better, because some probably quit before the other addiction-related brain changes have set in, while others are dealing with all of the brain changes. Alright, so the second brain change is called sensitization. It kind of sounds like desensitization, but it's nothing like that at all. What sensitization is that it's basically a memory of pleasure. So even though you are desensitized and numb when having an addiction, there is actually one thing you become more sensitive to, and that is triggers. Yes, that's right. And that's probably why it's called sensitization as well. And if you don't know what a trigger is, it is basically anything that reminds your brain of your drug of choice. So for a porn addict, a trigger could, for example, be seeing a hot fitness model on Instagram or a booty shaking video on YouTube and so on. And then those things trigger you to go and watch some real hardcore porn. Alright, so check this out. Whenever we learn a new habit or try to memorize a new thing, you are forming pathways in your brain. It is like you are walking in a field of grass. At first, it's heavy going, but the more you keep walking that exact same route, with time you form a rut or a small road in the grass. And now it's much easier to walk there. In fact, it is now easier to walk there than to not walk there. Well, you can think of these small roads in the grass as habits with normal day-to-day activities. But then with sensitization, that road in the grass is more like a super highway. Yeah, so sensitization is a super memory of pleasure. And whenever you are hit by a trigger, those sensitized pathways in your brain, well, they light up and start screaming for your drug. Yeah, so sensitization is what gives you those powerful cravings that can make you relapse back to your drug and blow away all your good intentions. Now here comes something really interesting about this. Many people are now probably thinking, well, I guess I'm not addicted then, because I wouldn't say I feel strong cravings to use porn. I'm just a bit horny at times, that's all. Well, here's the deal. I myself did not know I was addicted until I tried giving it up. And the reason for why I wanted to give up the porn was because I was struggling with weak erections. And when I read that porn could cause things like that, I decided to give it up for 90 days to see if they would improve. And then, to my big surprise, it was then I found out that I was actually not able to do it. I would go for 2 or 3 weeks without the porn, sometimes 4 or 5 weeks. But then I always relapsed back to it. And I kept relapsing for more than 7 years before I finally reached my goal of 90 days. Even though I was 100% determined to get to 90 days, I just couldn't do it. And listen to this, I had never been a heavy porn user either. I was only using it once or twice a week. But when I tried to give it up, I found that I just couldn't do it. And despite not using it on a daily basis, it still gave me many of the negative effects we talked about in part 1, including libido and erection problems. Now granted, my porn sessions were sometimes very, very long, because I was clicking from video to video to video, always chasing the next one. Now here's the thing, even if you really are addicted to porn, if you always use your porn whenever you're horny, the sensitized pathways won't start screaming at you. That only happens if you try to not use your drug. When I started trying to give up the porn, always when I got to my 2nd or 3rd week, whenever I got hit by a trigger, then I got to experience how powerful urges can really be. The sensitized pathways can even have such a big effect on you that your hands start trembling. I still remember the very first time that happened to me. My hands literally started trembling when I was hit by a visual trigger, and my heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't know it back then, but what was happening to me in that very moment was that those porn pathways in my brain, those sensitized pathways, were firing up like a Christmas tree. So again, the sensitized pathways may not show themselves to you before you had tried to give up your drug. Yeah, so if you think you're not addicted to porn, try giving it up for 60 or 90 days as an experiment. Then you'll find out. And I'm not saying you are. Maybe you are not addicted. But if you set a goal for yourself of 90 days without porn, it can be a really good experiment to find out where you stand. So here's the thing to remember. The nasty thing about the sensitized pathways is that they always become a bit stronger in the second and even stronger in the third week after quitting an addiction. But once you get over that hump and you get more than a month in or so, then they will slowly but surely start to become weaker and weaker. However, sensitization is nasty because once you are addicted, this is a brain change that will never really go away completely as long as you live. Now, they do become weaker, become dormant and fall asleep, so to speak. So it's not like you're going to have to deal with extreme urges for the rest of your life. But since they are only sleeping later on, it also means that they can easily be woken up. You may, for example, have heard that most sober alcoholics can't even drink one beer again, because if they do, they will relapse and start drinking heavily again. Well, now you know why. It's because if they try to drink in moderation, they can wake up those sleeping sensitized pathways. Yes, and so the sensitized pathways never fully go away. And it's the same with all addictions, porn addiction as well. Alright, so the third brain change is called Hypofrontality. Hypo means less than normal, and frontality refers to the part of your brain that is right behind your forehead. And this part of your brain is called prefrontal cortex. So then hypofrontality basically means less than normal functioning prefrontal cortex. And hypofrontality means that you have less blood flow to your prefrontal cortex. And if you didn't know, your PFC is the very control center of your brain. It is responsible for things like, for example, self-control, impulse control, pondering consequences, attention and focus, and more. Now, if you look at the first two there, now you also understand why it becomes harder to avoid your drug if you truly have an addiction. Because if you have less blood flow to the part of your brain that governs impulse control and self-control, well, obviously you will have a harder time withstanding temptations then as well. Especially if you're suddenly hit by a trigger. I mean, just think about it. At that moment, wouldn't you think impulse control would be a great thing to have? I think we can all agree on that, yes. And listen to this. What's so nasty about hypofrontality is that when the sensitized pathways light up, then the hypofrontality actually becomes temporarily even worse. Yes, so when the porn pathways start screaming in your brain, you get even less blood flow to your already negatively affected PFC. So it really becomes a double whammy here. And so no wonder that it can be difficult to not relapse and fall for urges if you really have developed a real addiction. And if you look at this one here, now you also understand why concentration and focus problems, like I mentioned in part 1, can become an issue. Especially when you consider that desensitization also plays a role in that. So here too, a real double whammy takes place. Now, unlike sensitization, this brain change can actually reverse completely once you quit your drug of choice. And we are going to talk more about reversing the brain changes in part 3 of the video series, where we will also take a look at the fourth and the last one of these addiction-related brain changes. Welcome to part 3 in the video series about what porn does to your brain. We talked about sensitization and hypofrontality, and you learned that sensitization is a brain change that never really goes away fully, even if you quit using whatever you are addicted to. But here it is important to point out that even though the sensitized pathways remain, it is still possible to have a wonderful life after your addiction. And again, it's not like you are doomed to a lifelong struggle with super powerful cravings either. But it is true that you will probably always have to be a bit careful with triggers in order to not relapse. I like the way Noah Church puts it. Think back of how it was trying to learn how to ride a bicycle. In the beginning, it was very difficult, right? Yes, but once you mastered the skill and became good at it, it became easy. But you still have to keep your eyes open in order not to crash into something. Well, it's a bit like that with the sensitized pathways. Even though you get skillful at handling your triggers, you still have to keep your eyes open and take it seriously in order not to crash into a relapse. Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy right there, so thank you, Noah, for that. Alright, so the last brain change is a malfunctioning stress system. If you have developed real addiction-related brain changes, in other words, if you have a real addiction to something, you are going to be more sensitive to stress. And you are going to get stressed out more easily than others. And on top of that, when you are getting stressed, you are also much more vulnerable to relapses. And this brain change is yet another reason for why people who watch a lot of porn can develop anxiety problems. Now here's the deal. When you develop an addiction, that addiction is going to hijack your dopamine system. And because of that, your brain is going to believe that your addiction is vital for survival. This is also why people can get real withdrawal symptoms when they give up the porn. Because the stress system can start protesting violently. Because your brain thinks that what you are doing now when you are quitting is a threat to your survival. So even though many porn addicts are struggling with stress and anxiety while they are addicted and while they are using the porn, you need to know that it can get even worse for a period of time after quitting, before it calms down and you finally start to feel much better. And a whole lot better than when you were using the porn. Now, it's different for everyone, but this often takes about a month or two before the strongest withdrawals calm down. For some, they go away quicker than that, and for others, they can last quite a bit longer. The key thing to remember here, though, is that right after quitting, it often gets worse before it gets better. And that includes your libido and erection problems as well, if porn made you struggle with that. So you can get a complete drop in libido for a few weeks after quitting. Now that period is called the flat line in the porn addiction community. But just like with the withdrawal symptoms, it's important to know that this is just a temporary phase, and that once you get out of it, the anxiety will go away and your libido will come back. So not only will the withdrawal symptoms go away, but you will start to feel so much better than you did back when you were using the porn. And your libido will come back in a good way, so that you once again get to enjoy having a strong and healthy libido for real life people with good quality erections. Alright, so now that we have talked about the 4 addiction-related brain changes, to really drive home the point in a fun and educational way here, like the great Gary Wilson said, this is what the 4 brain changes would say if they could speak. Desensitization would say, I can't get no satisfaction. And then the sensitized pathways would instantly poke you in the shoulder and go, hey, I got just what you need. And the stress system would scream, I need something to take the edge off now. And finally, hypofrontality would sigh and say, bad idea, but I just don't have the energy to stop you right now. Yeah, and so when you combine all of this, you really have a nasty package that works against your good intentions. And for those of you who have been trying to quit for a while, now you also understand why it's so easy to relapse back to using porn again. But you have to understand that it is fully possible to quit using porn. If I could do it, you can do it. And hundreds of thousands of others have done it as well. And if you've been struggling with a lot of the negative things I mentioned in part 1, and if porn is the cause of those negative things for you, then you should be excited about finding out about this, because that means that you can also get rid of those things, and that you can't yet even comprehend how good you can start feeling when doing so. You know, every single day we hear this from guys who have given up the porn. How amazingly good they start feeling. And not just guys, but from more and more people, men and women, every single day. Here's just what one of those guys has to say. Quote, I feel like the next Sir Isaac Newton or Leonardo da Vinci. Since I quit a month ago, I literally started a business, taken up the piano, been studying French every day, been programming, drawing, and I have more awesome ideas than I know what to do with. My confidence is sky high. I already feel like I can talk to any girl, and I'm the same guy who took 2.5 extra years to graduate from college because of procrastination and depression. Unquote. Isn't that beautiful? Now, I do have to say that that guy started seeing the benefits a bit sooner than most people. But that just goes to show that we are all different, just like I already mentioned. And when it comes to myself and the problems I were struggling with back in my porn days, if any of you are wondering, yes, I am 100% recovered today and everything works just as it's supposed to work, if you know what I mean. Now, in order to reverse these brain changes, the number one most important thing you should be doing is, of course, to remove the very thing that caused the brain changes in the first place. In other words, you have to stop using the porn. Now, there are other things you can do in addition to that to potentially help speed things up a bit. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But you have to understand that the main thing for you to do, if you want to reverse these brain changes, is to stop using the porn. Now, you can still have normal sex with real life people and you can still do porn-free masturbation and still recover from a porn addiction just fine. However, with a small caveat here. For those of you who are struggling with porn-induced ED, you should know that even though masturbation in and of itself cannot cause ED, many guys tend to recover from PIED faster if they also take a temporary break from masturbation. And then once they regain their ability to have a strong erection and libido for real-life people, some of them start masturbating again, but without the porn, of course. You do not want to go back to porn, because porn was the very thing that caused all of these problems in the first place. Welcome to part 4 in the video series about porn and your brain. Today we are only going to talk about how to heal your brain after porn addiction. Or more accurately, how to reverse the addiction-related brain changes. Alright, so let's start with desensitization, as it's the biggest one, and since it's also the one we can be the most proactive with and have the most options with. The number one thing to fix desensitization is, of course, to stop using the porn. And another important thing for people to know here is that if you have any other addictions going on besides porn addiction and you are still engaging in those, then your desensitized reward system won't heal if you just give up the porn. And then, as you remember in part 2 of this video series, I mentioned that it's possible to knock out some of your dopamine receptors even if you're not addicted. That means that this is why you also have to be careful and moderate your use of other supernormal stimuli as well. And if you're now wondering, what is a supernormal stimuli? Well, it's a good question. A supernormal stimuli is basically something that is more stimulating for your brain's reward system than we can naturally find in nature. Things like video games, social media, online gambling, junk food, alcohol, and so on. So for example, even if you're not addicted to alcohol, but you drink quite a lot of it, you should know that that really hammers your poor dopamine receptors. The same goes if you spend a huge amount of time playing super stimulating video games, or if you spend many hours a day mindlessly scrolling on social media. Now listen up here. It's not like you can't do things like that in moderation and never reverse your desensitization, because you certainly can, but you should know that all those activities are highly dopamine driven, and if you go hard with them, you are definitely slowing down the healing, and if you go really hard with them, you simply won't be able to upregulate those dopamine receptors. Alright, so those are the things you should remove or be careful with. Let's now look at things you can add Sunshine has actually been shown to help upregulate your dopamine receptors. Kind of a bummer that the winter is here right now. But in general, being outside when the weather is good is beneficial for your dopamine system. Intermittent fasting has also been shown to help increase the number of your dopamine receptors. Physical exercise as well, and especially high-intensity interval training. Now, since I know many of the guys out here are willing to do pretty much anything to recover, I have to put a warning here. Never ever take any of these to the extremes, because you can hurt yourself if you do. That goes for all of them, so educate yourself on them first and use your head here. For example, if you start overtraining, you are not doing your dopamine system any favor. Cold showers have also been shown to increase both dopamine and your dopamine receptors. And I seriously believe that you can speed up the recovery of your desensitized dopamine system by taking cold showers frequently. Socializing could potentially also help a bit with your dopamine receptors, especially if you somehow manage to win some competition or win something else, or somehow climb in status in that particular setting and group of people. Because biology has made it so that you will get a small reward by getting a few more of those small dopamine receptors if you somehow climb in status or win something. Remember, desensitization means you have less of those receptors, so getting more of them is exactly what we want. Some over-the-counter supplements that may help create a few more dopamine receptors are CDP-choline and myoinositol. But probably the number one most effective thing you can do to help speed up the recovery of desensitization is implementing different dopamine fasting protocols from time to time. Now, it's impossible to say just how much faster you can recover by doing this, but from all the things I've seen and experienced myself, I'd say it's probably quite significant. Now, this video is already going to get very long, so I won't go into detail about exactly how to do dopamine fasting here. But if you want to know more about this, I do have a whole online course about this, and about all kinds of different ways of doing dopamine fasting, and about what's the best way of doing different protocols. You can find a link to that course under the video. But I don't want to make this a promotion of my own stuff, so I'll just leave it at that, and we will quickly move on to the next one, which is the malfunctional stress system. Again, the number one most important thing is of course to quit the porn. The second one is going to be physical exercise, and with this brain change, zone 2 cardio seems to be the most effective one for calming your anxiety down. If you don't know what zone 2 cardio is, then you can easily Google it. And I know what I'm about to say next is going to sound strange to some of you, but I'm being absolutely serious here. The third point is accept that it's going to take some time for this one to reverse, about 1 to 2 months or so, for some maybe a bit longer. The reason for why this is important is because when it comes to things like anxiety, then if you resist that negative feeling, or even if you start asking yourself questions like, why do I have to feel like this, or how long will this last, then you should know that you are now making your situation twice as bad. Why? Well, it's like the great Buddha said, anytime we suffer misfortune, 2 arrows fly our way. Being struck by an arrow is painful. Being struck by a second arrow is even more painful. In life, we can't always control the first arrow. However, the second arrow is our reaction to the first. So the second arrow is optional. So, what I mean by this is that if your porn addiction has caused a malfunctioning stress system for you with anxiety and stress as a result, then that's the first arrow. But you can avoid the pain of the second arrow by not resisting it and not asking yourself these kinds of questions. So, other than this, there's not much more you can do about this brain change. Let it take the time it needs. Let's move on to hypofrontality. And here too, the number one thing is, of course, to stop using the porn. And the second most effective thing is meditation. meditation. Yes, there are many studies out there showing how people who meditate regularly have a much better functioning prefrontal cortex, and I fully believe you can help speed up this brain change by doing a lot of meditation. And physical exercise is also going to help here. As you remember, hypofrontality means less blood flow to your PFC, and physical exercise of course helps to increase blood flow to your brain. The third thing you can do here is to train your no-go muscle. In other words, practice to not do something you have an urge to do. For example, you're sitting at your kitchen table and you hear that you get a notification on your phone and you instantly get an urge to check what it is. Well, you can practice your no-go muscle by making yourself wait for 10 minutes or so before you check it. And this sounds so simple, but it really works on building a stronger PFC. Same thing when you are doing physical exercise, for example. Let's say you're out running. It's pretty painful, and after a while you will naturally get an urge to just stop running. Well, if you ignore that urge and you keep on going a few more minutes, then you are also training this part of your brain. Now, again, warning here, this doesn't mean you should take physical exercise to the extremes, but you already know that by now, right? But you can always ignore that urge to stop running at least 3 to 4 times before you actually listen to it. The same thing goes if you are taking a cold shower. If you override the first urge to turn off the water, well, again, you are training this part of the brain. And then the sensitization. Again, the number one thing for you to do here is to stop using the porn. And then with this one, there's unfortunately not much else you can do about this lifelong brain change other than to don't feed the addiction and avoid porn substitutes. So for example, let's say you are trying to go for porn use in moderation. Well, if it really is the case that you have developed a real addiction to porn, then going for moderation is probably not going to work, because every time you're using it, you are feeding these sensitized pathways. And by doing so, you never allow them to become weaker and fall asleep. And also avoid using all kinds of different porn substitutes, because they also feed the sensitized porn pathways in your brain and will prevent them from becoming weaker. And by porn substitutes, I mean any form of digital activity you do in order to arouse yourself sexually. So when it comes to sexual things, whenever in doubt, say yes to real life people and no to artificial digital sexually arousing stuff. Now, if you are wondering if you are addicted to porn or not, or if you think you might need some helpful tips on how to quit using the porn, then I would highly recommend that you download my free 90-day no porn advice and tool guide right now by using the link under the video. In the end of that guide, there is also a link to a porn addiction test that you can take to find out where you stand. Now, this is not a big online course or anything like that, but it's a really helpful and easy to read PDF guide. And again, I'm giving it away to you 100% free of charge.
And if you ever wondered how long your reboot is going to take and what factors play a part in how quickly you'll recover, then take a look at the video you see on the screen right here, because over there you'll discover some truly fascinating things, right? This is Scandinavian Bob signing out for today. Consider giving me a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.